Hi everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar, which is focusing on the challenge of resource management, specifically water. My name's Karen. I work for Discover the World Education, having previously taught geography for over 20 years. I think most of you that are online have probably seen some of our revision webinars previously. We do have another set of four. The first one looking at the challenge of natural hazards, specifically looking at Iceland as a case study. And our second series was focusing on the challenge of resource management, looking at energy and looking at three completely different case studies, actually, Iceland, Costa Rica and Norway. So if you did miss those and you want to use them for your lessons or for added revision, for independent study, anytime, they are available through the website. So please just click on the links through the website and then that will take you straight through to the videos. Most of them are around about 30 to 45 minutes long, so really nice for a homework activity or just for that extended knowledge and understanding that you may wish your students to have. As always, please do ask any questions that you may have in the chat box. My lovely colleague Kat, you will see she comes up as Discover the World Education on the video at the moment. She will pass any questions that you have over to me and I will do my best to answer them. Please do try and keep them relevant to the topic and obviously, as to the actual subject that we're looking at, but we will try and answer those. I'm going to lose the video, my video, just for the first slide, just because you can then see the full screen and slide and give you all the information that you possibly need. But I'll pop back up at the end just to sort of like put everything into summary for you. Okay, so let's get started. So the aims of this webinar are to look at the demand for water and the resource to see that it is rising globally, but the supply of the water can actually be insecure, which may lead to conflict. We're also going to look at different strategies that we can use to increase water supply and some of those strategies that are being used across the world. And then tomorrow, if you want to join us tomorrow, we actually have a guest speaker with myself tomorrow, Richard Thompson from the Esplar Education Centre in Mallorca. And he will specifically look at Mallorca and how the Mallorcans are obtaining a sustainable water supply for not only the residents in Mallorca, but obviously for the tourist numbers that do visit Mallorca as well. As always, we're going to give you opportunities for how your students can think and write like geographers, a little reminder on that. And then obviously, as we go through the webinar, you will see that there are quite obvious sort of opportunities where that can be used. Okay, so let's have a quick look then at what it really means to think and write like a geographer. We often as teachers ask our students to do this, and so it is really important to remind you, if you're a student on this webinar, or actually if you're a teacher, what we're actually asking our students to do. So thinking like a geographer means that we want the students to think about topics and aspects from a social, a physical, an environmental, an economical, and more importantly, a political viewpoint. Not only that, we want our students to look at things from a local and a global scale, both now and in the future. Most importantly, we want our students, and we want you, if you are a student, to actually think quite critically. We want you to not just follow the crowd, not just read and hear and see things and always believe them straight away, but to actually challenge that. Look at it from lots of different viewpoints. And as we know, geographers really do make connections because we want them to connect all of these different things together, and we want them to look at different countries and to see how countries compare and contrast. As well as this, we want geographers, don't we, to, explain issues, how one thing leads to another. It's a real process. We want them to sort of like look at the causes, the consequences, to argue and assess to develop and extend, to use connectives which can lead to, we want them to tell the examiner why certain things are happening. And then we want them to make a decision or a judgment based on the information and the understanding that they have. And it's highly important that throughout this whole process, they use keywords in their speaking, in their writing. They know what they mean so they can use them effectively when they're answering those questions, both the short and the long questions, actually. So now let's move on and just look at water. This map shows those areas in the world that have a water surplus, as well as those that have a water deficit. Regions that have a water surplus basically means have a supply of water which exceeds demand. Bottom line, they generally have more water than they actually need. Other regions, however, have a water deficit, which means that demand exceeds supply. Bottom line, they don't have enough water. Now, if we look at this distribution, you can see that those areas who are often in water deficit are many countries in Africa, Australia, and parts of the Middle East, Southwest Asia, and the southern USA and Central South America. Let's look at some of the reasons why these areas are in deficit. Some of these areas may have low rainfall, high densities of population and or industry, which increases a demand for water. Low rainfall areas, such as Australia, for example, and various parts of Africa, as well as the desert areas, do have a very low rainfall across the year, and sometimes they receive no rainfall at all for several years. Sometimes a water deficit can be caused by high population densities, and you can see from this bubble graph on the right-hand side some of those areas where these high population densities are. If there are more people, there is more demand for water. Sometimes there is more industry, which again leads to more demand for water. So newly emerging economies are now facing very high demands for water, and this can cause a water deficit. Let's look at three terms that you really need to know. The first one is water security. This means having access to enough clean water to sustain well-being, good health, and economic development. And then we have water insecurity. This describes a situation where regions do not have access to sufficient water supplies. Now, this differs from countries who at times suffer from water stress. Countries begin to experience water stress when less than 1,700 cubic meters of water is available per person per year. The World Resources Institute finds that 37 countries currently face extremely high levels of water stress, meaning that more than 80% of the water available to agricultural, domestic, and industrial users is withdrawn annually. Qatar, Israel, and Lebanon were all ranked as the most stressed countries in the world, with Baghdad in Afghanistan and Gaborone and Jawang in Botswana being the world's most water-stressed regions. Nearly 1.8 billion people in 17 countries, or a quarter of the world's population, appear to be veering towards a water crisis, with the potential of several severe shortages in the next few years. India, which is ranked 13 of the list of countries with extremely high water risk, has more than 3 times the population of the other 16 countries in this category combined. Water scarcity is a physical, objective reality that can be measured consistently across regions and over time. Water stress, as we know it, refers to the ability or lack of being able to meet human and ecological demand for water. Compared to scarcity, water stress is a more inclusive and broader concept. And tomorrow we'll look at Mallorca as a case study. And as we know, Mallorca suffers from a water scarcity as well as stress. And we will look at how the Mallorcans have learnt to adapt to this. So why is water consumption increasing? Let's look first of all at population growth. Over the last 2 centuries, the world's population growth has grown at a very rapid exponential rate. It has grown by over 5 billion, and all of these people have demands on the world's fresh water. Most of this growth has been in LICs and NEEs, the low-income countries and the newly emerging economies. According to the UN, people need at least 20 litres of clean water per day for their basic needs. Now, if we think about it, 20 litres of water, if we think what we use on a daily basis, that isn't very much at all. So we know that as a country, we are using more than what the UN says that we actually need. I know that a shower takes far more than 20 litres of clean water per day. So that might be something you wish to think about. Population growth has not only had a big impact on domestic water usage, but also increased demand on the use of water for both food production, agriculture, and industry. This can be seen on this graph, which shows total water withdrawal increasing with global population. This graph shows the amount of water that is consumed each day. As you can see, high-income countries tend to have higher levels of water consumption compared to MICs and LICs. Many countries are developing at a rapid rate across the world, and this increases water consumption through, number one, rising living standards. People in countries have become richer, have got more money to spend on items that consume water, such as dishwashers, washing machines, flushing toilets and showers. People also tend to eat more meat, which needs much more water for its production. The second reason could be industrial growth. As countries develop, manufacturing industries consume more water. Thirdly, we have farming, which changes with economic development because modern commercial agriculture uses huge amounts of water in irrigation systems. And this is a country's largest user of water. And then we have virtual water. This is water that moves around the world because it is embedded in farm products and manufactured goods. It refers to the hidden flow of water in food or other commodities which are traded from one place to another. And just to give you an example here, it takes 1,340 cubic meters of water to produce 1 metric ton of wheat. There are huge inequalities in water use between countries. Generally, the greater wealth and standard of living in a country, the higher the per person consumption of water. So what is water used for? It's used for farming and agriculture, watering and irrigation systems, plus drinking water for animals, and in food products for processing and cooling. For energy, water is essential for hydroelectric power and the steam that is used to drive turbines in fossil fuel powered and nuclear powered power station, like the Akata nuclear power station that we can see here. It is also used to provide cooling in geothermal power stations. And domestic uses include drinking, cooking and washing, as well as leisure usage, including parks, golf courses and swimming pools. These uses really vary from place to place depending on the level of development, and we can see from this graph here that the USA has a much greater withdrawal for agriculture and industry than, for example, the Republic of Congo. There are many factors which affect the availability of water. These include geology, climate, rivers, pollution, over-abstraction, infrastructure, and poverty. So let's first of all look at the physical factors. Rivers and geology can really affect where water is stored. Impermeable rocks allow water to remain on the surface, which then has to be transferred, and so links to rivers. When rocks are permeable, water can infiltrate into the ground and then can either be moved by underground river systems or in storage. River systems can be erratic in dry, arid zones and therefore are at times unreliable as a source of water. Climate will influence the availability of rainfall, snowfall, and rates of evaporation. And the climate and weather can vary with wetter and drier periods, plus hotter and colder periods. And this can all affect water availability. Areas with low rainfall, low groundwater supplies, few lakes and rivers, and generally arid conditions have difficulties accessing water simply because it's just not available. For example, Saudi Arabia has very little accessibility to fresh water, and most water is therefore removed from the ocean and desalinated, which is, of course, a very costly procedure. I learned just recently that the energy prices in Norway this year have been extremely low. And the reason for that is they have had so much snowfall that they have been able to store loads and loads and loads of fresh water, which has been used in their hydroelectric power plants. And also they have an abundance of fresh water this year, literally because their snow levels have been extremely high. There may be countries in the alpine regions at the moment who are having a real water abundance because we know that there's been huge amounts of snowfall in the European areas around the Alps at the moment. So now let's look at some of the human factors. Water infrastructure. These are the pipeworks and the plants and the pumps which are needed to guarantee water supply, and it is closely linked to the financial status of a country. Many high-income countries can afford such infrastructure. However, in poorer countries, this just isn't possible. According to WaterAid, in Nigeria, 57 million people do not have access to safe water. And over 130 million Nigerians don't have access to adequate sanitation, which basically means clean toilets. I think that's an unbelievable figure just in a country that actually is quite wealthy in certain areas. The poverty levels are so low in other areas that there's just huge amounts of people just in this one country that don't have access to clean water or adequate sanitation. And then another fact for you, over 600,000 children in Nigeria under the age of 5 die each year from disease caused, sorry, not 600, 60,000 people under the age of 5 die each year from disease caused by poor water and sanitation. That's a really high number of children that are dying every year. So if you look at the infant mortality rate, much of that will be because of poor water and sanitation. Freshwater sources around the world are often threatened by water pollution, and water resources are under threat through wastage and our thoughtless dirtying of it. Human activity can pollute both surface and groundwater supplies. The main sources of water pollution are discharge of untreated raw sewage, chemicals and heavy metals from industry, agricultural runoff, and of course, human littering. This picture here comes from a water storage area in Brazil, where untreated sewage is actually being dumped in this particular water source. Over-abstraction means that when too much water is taken out of an aquifer, it can limit future water supplies and actually have quite drastic consequences. As Mexico City's population exploded during the last century, the ability to supply water became insufficient and just did not meet demand. This resulted in too much groundwater extraction, which has contributed in the continued subsidence of Mexico City. Now, we know that Mexico City is also on a plate boundary, so they have really sort of like made this area very, very unstable. Now, Mexico City lives below the current Lake Texaco, and it has increased the chance of catastrophic flooding in the mid-20th century. Mexico City ground subsided a reported 40 centimetres per year in some areas. 40 centimetres is a massive amount for this city to actually be moving, and this is due to the increasing extraction of groundwater. The subsidence can also cause pipes to break, sinkholes to appear, and can also allow salt water to intrude the inland, which pollutes the groundwater. This picture is of Mexico City Cathedral, and it's tilting. The photograph isn't tilted, actually. The actual building is tilting, literally because of the over-extraction of the groundwater in this area. So let's now look more closely at the main impacts of water insecurity. The key words that you need to know here are water conflict and waterborne diseases. Waterborne diseases are caused by microorganisms that are transmitted into and they contaminate the water. Examples of these diseases could be cholera, typhoid, or botulism. Water conflict are when disputes between different regions or countries about the distribution and use of fresh water occur, and conflicts arise from the gap between growing demands and diminishing supplies. The lack of available clean water poses a significant problem for people and for governments around the world. It can actually be catastrophic. So conflict can take place in many forms, from a simple disagreement to all-out war. In the UK, there are national debates over where water is moved from surplus areas in the west to the deficit areas in the southeast. And water conflicts can occur between a neighbouring country that share a water source that have a transboundary, for example, a river or a sea. This is particularly apparent in the Middle East. They have only 1% of the world's fresh water, yet 5% of the world's population. And according to UNESCO, current interstate conflicts occur mainly in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Central Asia. It's important to discuss and evaluate how we can increase water supply. The world has enough water. High-income countries have a greater ability to increase water supply, either by purifying, cleaning, trapping and transferring it. And many projects are very large scale and do have sort of like economic and social benefits, or impacts on sort of like the area. They involve high levels of engineering skill and resources. However, more sustainable solutions are also possible going on in the future. Now, looking at the lack of clean water and waterborne diseases, water quality can have a massive impact on people. And this links to India and its attempts to clean up the River Ganges. Poor water has a direct impact on people's lives as an essential element for life. And poor water can actually weaken people, which therefore means that it has a direct impact on their productivity and economic development. Things like diarrhea, yellow fever, malaria, cholera are all big issues in terms of having sort of like these waterborne diseases and a clean lack of clean water supply. According to WaterAid, 800 children per day, that's one child every 2 minutes, dies because of a lack of clean water and waterborne diseases. 663 million people don't have access to safe water. That's 1 in 10 of the world's population. And 2.4 billion people, that's 1/5 of the world's population, doesn't have access to adequate sanitation. I found those figures when I was putting these slides together actually quite sort of like distressing. To think that 1/5 of the world's population doesn't have access to adequate sanitation is actually quite a figure that shocked me. We look at this picture of water pollution. This actually is an area in the Niger Delta where oil is produced. And the Ogoni people have noticed big impacts from pollution in their waters because of the oil spills into the waterways and the groundwater. People, unfortunately, are having to eat contaminated fish, and the agriculture is very badly affected. And this has caused more mercury poisoning, which impacts on pregnant women and increases the number of deformed babies that are being born. Obviously, the impacts on food production due to a lack of water really does impact the supply throughout the year. Water is used to boost crop yields and to water plants during drier periods, and it has a significant boost to food supplies, which can positively impact on people's lives. In terms of the industrial output, we know that water is used to make things in water products and is essential for cooling and processing. Hydroelectric power plants need water. And as you can see, where there are areas where there's a real scarce water, it can cause quite a lot of conflict. This picture here is showing how people are desperately in need for water. And as we know, conflicts can really occur, particularly in the Middle East, where there is a major problem. This picture is actually taken from Syria, where they actually have to take round the water, and then it is given sort of like basically on rations to people who don't have access to a clean water supply. Okay, so let's look at increasing water supply. We've already talked about how high-income countries have a greater ability to increase water supply, really because they have the money, they have high levels of engineering skill, but we do know that actually we can start looking at more sustainable solutions, which are much possible and smaller in scale. They're less expensive and can be maintained by local people. One way in which we can manage water supply is to build huge concrete and steel structures called dams. These dams block the rivers and they cause the water carried by rivers to back up and flood the valley upstream of the dam, creating a large lake known as a reservoir. This water can then be used or released through the dam to provide or produce hydroelectric power. By building the dam, it allows engineers to control the flow of a river, and it can be therefore used to store water during wet periods or at times of water storage. A local UK example might be in Newcastle upon Tyne, where they get some of their water from the Kielder Water Dam and Reservoir. And China has just completed the construction of the world's largest dam, in addition to the 3 Gorges dams. And this dam has reduced the risk of flooding downstream of the dams that were there before. Recent flooding prior to the dam actually affected millions of people and ruined quite a lot of farmland. So this new dam will actually protect over 25,000 hectares of farmland. However, the environmental impacts are that 1.4 million people in China had to be moved to make way for the 600-kilometre lake that has actually been formed behind the dam. And there are problems with the sediment that is building up behind the dam as well. Now, as we know, dams can be really expensive. They are huge engineering projects that require vast financial resources. The dam in the Brazil and Paraguay border actually cost $20 billion US. So huge amounts of money. Okay. Globally, there are 50,000 large dams, and dams over the years have flooded a land area the size of Spain. Their reservoirs actually contain 3 times as much water that are in the world's rivers, and consistently lose close to 4 Niagara Falls worth of water due to evaporation. Over the world, dams generate 16% of the world's electricity, and they irrigate actually food crops for up to 12 to 15% of the world's population. So they are really, really important. However, they do block the migration of fish, they can deplete rivers of oxygen, and they do actually sort of, interfere with the biological and the ecological nature of rivers. But they do have their place in maintaining a consistent water supply. Just to give you some facts here. Okay, so water transfers are another way that we can ensure that water is moved from areas that have a surplus to those that have a deficit. And diversion or water transfer schemes simply move the water from an area of surplus to an area which has a deficit. Now, this can either take place through gravity systems or using large pumping stations, and it's moved in canals and pipes. Now, right back in the Roman times, they used aqueducts to move water around the Mediterranean, like the Pont du Gard, whilst modern systems tend to use pipes. The Kielder Water Transfer Scheme, which is the one that we mentioned in the UK, is a local scheme within a river basin, but there are bigger schemes like the one that you can see here, which is the Tagus Segura project in Spain and the South-North Water Transfer project, which you can see here in China. Desalination is when we remove salt and other minerals to create fresh drinkable water, and this is something that is used heavily in the Middle East. Desalination is used where fresh water supplies are short, but seawater is plentiful, and it can supply a community with fresh water for households, manufacturing, or agriculture. In the past, desalination was deemed too expensive to be considered a viable large-scale option. It simply required too much energy. But over the years, newer technologies have slowly started to change that opinion, particularly in places where sources of fresh water are scarce and people are plentiful. This means that at present, desalination remains a process available only to the wealthiest of countries. Countries that are treating seawater at the moment are Japan, Australia, some areas in Spain, and some of the Middle Eastern states such as United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. Australia has recently spent $13 billion on desalination plants for 5 of its major cities, and they're hopeful that this will provide up to 30% of their water in the future. A sustainable water supply is really, really important, and we have spoken before in our webinars about sustainable development and the 3 pillars that link to sustainable development. We have to have environmental integrity, we have to have economic value, and we have to have benefits to society. And when these 3 pillars merge, that is when you have got true sustainable development and sustainability. Sorry, I went through too quickly. The key words that you need to know here: sustainable development, development that meets the needs of the present without limiting the availability and the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And a sustainable water supply is meeting the present day need for safe, reliable and affordable water, which minimises adverse effects on the environment whilst enabling future generations to meet their requirements. We need to make sure with water sustainability that there is a balance between what is consumed and what is used. We need to ensure that the water remains of good quality to try and avoid pollution. We need to allow for stores to be built up, and we need to manage the water that falls into places effectively. And if we can do this, we will have a sustainable water supply which meets the present day needs for a safe, reliable and affordable water, but it minimises the adverse effects on the environment, enabling future generations to meet their requirements. Now, some of the ways that we can look at conserving water is to look at strategies that we need to protect our water resources. They involve the preservation, control and development of water resources, both surface and groundwater, the prevention of pollution, Water conservation strategies are used to use more water more efficiently. And we've already seen that population size, household size, and the level of wealth all affect how much water is used. Factors such as climate change have increased pressures on natural water resources, especially in manufacturing and agricultural irrigation. Groundwater management is something that is really important, and the regulation and control of water levels, together with the pollution, ownership and use of groundwater, really need to be considered. When it rains, we know that some of the water infiltrates the ground and goes underground, and this water is known as groundwater. This vital water source can be managed by preventing contamination of groundwater so that it can be used as a resource for fresh drinking water. If we limit the use of groundwater so that natural regeneration of contaminated groundwater takes place, that will mean that we will have a continued resource. In the UK, as you probably know, there's a company or an agency called the Environmental Agency, and these have the responsibility of managing the groundwater in the UK. It's a really important storage system for us in the UK. Now, methods which we can use to conserve water, there's lots of them actually, and we're just going to really focus on these ones. Harvesting rainwater, household, the management, farming, and the business. Okay, digging ponds, lakes, canals, expanding the water reservoirs and installing rainwater catching ducts and filtration systems on homes are all different methods of harvesting rainwater. Harvested and filtered rainwater could be used for toilets, home gardening, lawn irrigation, and small-scale agriculture. And water butts and guttering can be used to collect rainwater. We can also use low flow shower heads, low flush toilets, or dual flush toilets, and these use up to 67% less water than conventional toilets. The reuse of grey water for flushing toilets or watering gardens. We look at the high efficiency clothes washers, the drip irrigation for watering gardens rather than sprinklers, and farmers could switch from using open canals and flood irrigation to drip methods instead, because they're much easier in terms of making an even distribution. Overhead irrigation is slightly more efficient, and sprinklers, but this drip irrigation is definitely the most efficient, and at the moment the least used type, but it does offer the ability to deliver water to the roots of the plants, which really means that the plants get the maximum amount of water that they can. We're starting to see the use of hydroponics within greenhouses, which can really save on water. And we know that businesses can save lots of water too. We could sort of have waterless car washes, so we're using the grey water for that. Rainwater harvesting, water saving steam sterilisers in hospitals and healthcare. So there's lots of little ways that actually most areas, countries and people could start introducing into their homes and their businesses to help conserve water. If we look at grey water use, this is where basically water is recycled, and this really is a good solution. And it's often done with sewage and drainage water that has been filtered and treated to get rid of the solids and impurities. It can be then used to recharge groundwater aquifers, to irrigate fields for farming, to use to cool in industrial processes, and to top up the rivers. And one type of recycling water is actually to use this grey water, where the household waste water from sinks, washing machines and dishwashers is recycled and put to good use. And uses could include water for laundry and toilet flushing. Treated grey water can also be used to irrigate both food and non-food producing plants. And the nutrients in the grey water actually provide an excellent food source for these plants. So we've looked at lots of different ways that actually we could start sort of like increasing our conservation of water. So just some concluding thoughts here. The demand for water resources is rising globally, but the supply can be insecure, which may lead to conflict. Different strategies can be used to increase water supply. And we've looked at some of those ways that we can actually both increase water supply by taking the surplus and maybe storing it to use in times when we have a deficit, as well as looking at different reasons as to how we can conserve water as well. We also had some reminders today of how to think and write like geographers, and I hope that I gave you a little bit of extended knowledge on sustainability and about making different connections between countries. If you want to extend even further, I would really recommend that you look at some of the resources that we will be developing over the next couple of months. We have some really exciting new resources and some teacher and student notes based on the Down to Earth series with Zac Efron and the Netflix film by David Attenborough, A Life on Our Planet. Both amazing programs that I highly recommend. And then if you go onto the ITV Hub, there is an incredible sort of like docu-series led by the three presenters there, but really Laura Tobin, who's an amazing meteorologist and completely passionate about the climate crisis and the lack of water that we may be suffering from in the future. And they've done a very fantastic program that you can just download. If I leave you with the thought that as an exam sort of like marker and as a geography teacher for some years, I always a little bit of the X factor. Give me something different. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing the case study tomorrow on Mallorca, because whilst we know that it can't be used sort of like per se as a case study in accordance with the specifications, it is just the most amazing case study that we can use for sort of like comparison and contrasting sort of like studies and understanding, and it will really extend your knowledge in terms of how a very small country has made very big progress in terms of ensuring that they are water secure. I leave you with the fact that geographers make connections and they have an awareness of countries. We want you to learn loads and loads about countries. We have lots of prior and extended knowledge, and all the time we're trying to make sense of the world, aren't we? Stay safe, everybody, be kind, and hopefully we will see you tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Have a good rest of the evening. Thank you. Eight o'clock.